Thank you very much. Thank you so much for coming today. It's a really exciting season at Hoxton Hall as I'm running a heritage programme called Activate, and we are celebrating the month of May alongside Hackney History Festival, and the month of May is about May Scott. And May Scott was a big figure in Hackney in Hoxton Hall's history, and our speaker today, David, knew May Scott and worked alongside her. So the perfect person to kick off 5 different events that we'll be running throughout this month. David has had a long history with Hoxton Hall. He first came to work with May Scott in the 1970s, and they continue to work throughout the decade with Hoxton Hall Theatre Project, which I think we're going to hear a lot about. I'm very excited. And he still supports Hoxton Hall today as the chair of our trustees. In the meantime, David has been very busy and has been continuing to champion for young people and diversity in the UK and beyond. And this has led to him leading projects and having directorships with such amazing programmes such as the Royal Court Young People's Theatre and Young Writers Festival, the International Festival of Young Playwrights in Australia, the National Foundation for Youth Music, Help Musicians UK, National Opera Studios, Diverse Voices, and he was recognised for his work in arts, education and charity with an OBE in 2014. Yeah! Incredible! Yeah, and I've only skimmed the surface of the incredible arts projects and programmes that David has run throughout the years, but there's no one better to talk about it than himself, so can we please welcome David Sulkin.
I really do. I'm the sort of person who prides himself on having a loud voice, but I'm going to use this today because I think it's a low ceiling and it would be hard to make myself absolutely clear to people sitting at the back. Firstly, thanks, Suzannah, and thanks to the archive and to the Hackney Society. It's great to come to this archive. It seems so lively and busy and full of people all the time whenever I've been here. I live in Islington, and I was recently at their archive, and it's more like a graveyard than this. Hoxton Hall and the work that I was involved with wonderful colleagues in the early 1970s, changed my life. I was thinking about giving this talk, and I'm involved in another project, a history project in Islington. And I'm looking at census records. And when I see somebody born in the same year as me, but a century earlier, i.e. 1949, and they're still alive in, say, 1930, you realize what huge change happened in that period. And it's similar in my life too. Look how much life is changing around us. We're now in Green Hackney, I believe, and this may be the first public speech that's given as part of Green Hackney, but the pace of change and the change around us, and also our ability to have excellent memories and look back. When I think back to 1973, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, when I worked at Hoxton Hall, it seems to lots of young people who were born in the late 90s or early thousands like ancient history. And it certainly looks like ancient history when you look at videos of Hoxton in the 1970s. When you think about the state of the world in the 1970s, we were at the dying end of a socialist period. We were waiting for Mrs. Thatcher to come into power. Our miners' strike were on the horizon. The 3-day week, limited amount of electricity. You'd get up in the morning, wonder if you'd turn on the electric fire, but you couldn't. Candles in the evening. It really does sound like ancient history. In Hoxton, there was desperate poverty. Although there'd been a lot of building work for social housing after the war, private property was still very badly kept, and people had very low expectations of where they could live and how they could live. Hoxton was the hotbed of the National Front. This is a history session, so I must remember to get the words right. But the leader of the National Front lived on the Regent's Canal, and there were a lot of very strong working class supporters of the National Front in Hoxton in those days. And we weren't a political organisation at Hoxton Hall, but we knew who the people were, and we knew what their expectations of us would be, and we knew how to manage our way around them. I'm sort of middle class, really, except that my grandfather came from Poland to Hackney in 1902, but I grew up on the south coast, and I had a very comfortable life, and I went to drama school. And I think I went to the right drama school because, in fact, what we were studying was theatre arts, not training to be an actor. That's the Rose Bruford College. And the ethos is still the same there today. At the end of that course, I went to work in Africa for 2 years at the Jonville Mall Theatre. And when I came back, surprise, surprise, nobody knew who I was, so there was no work. And so I did the odd bit of freelancing, television work, a couple of adverts, one drinking beer, another one for getting shirts dirty and how wonderful a soap powder was to clean them. And then I saw an advertisement for a role at Hoxton Hall, and I went to a rigorous 2-day audition, and I was living with some friends in South Hackney, and when I got home, they said, how did it go? And I said it went very well. And somebody rang me, Terry Goodfellow rang me and said, well, we've given the job to somebody else, but you can come to us for 6 months. And I put the phone down and I said to my friend, who was very wise, well, if they don't want me, I shan't go. And she said, I shouldn't be proud, you might learn something. So I changed my mind overnight and took up the offer and was paid £1,500 for 6 months' work, but stayed 4 years. And in those 4 years, I understood for the first time what poverty of opportunity really looked like. Poverty, financial poverty too. And I joined something called the Hoxton Hall Community Theatre and Education Project. And some of you here, I know all about it as I speak. So this is a very particular and personal view of mine. And the objective of the project was to use theatre and drama as a medium for changing people's expectations of their own lives and of themselves, and for the opportunity to look beyond the boundary of Hoxton. Hoxton's still the same in some ways as it was in the 70s. It's a kind of geographic island just north of the richest city in the world, which some people in those days called the arsehole of London, really. And so the project that I joined was conceived by a group of teachers who were working in different parts of London. And one of the teachers, Terry Goodfellow, was working at Shoreditch School, and he knew about Hoxton Hall because of that, and asked May Scott, about whom you've already heard, if they could rehearse at Hoxton Hall. And May at that point was thinking of retiring. She was thinking about succession, and it was a very big, imaginative and bold leap of hers to recommend to the Hoxton Hall freeholders, the Bedford Institute Association, a Quaker outfit, that Terry and the team running the education project should take over the responsibility for the hall, which they did. Now, one thing that I was very grateful for at the Rose Bruford College was expanding your horizons about how theatre and drama would work. The Nevern Square group were absolutely committed to self-devising, so creating plays according to their audience. And one thing I had learned at the Rose Bruford College was that, in a way, the most important thing in theatre was the audience, not the actors, not the play, but who's going to hear what you're doing. And so the plays that we devised together had particular foci, I suppose you'd say, on the communities that we were aiming to serve. And I'll deal with some of those plays by way of example a bit later on in this talk. But going back to me for a moment, you know, I was on a bus when I was 14, going home from a performance of Strindberg's Easter. It's a play about bankruptcy, about guilt, and it's set in a very cold part of Sweden. And I remember on this bus going home, I didn't realize that you could say serious things through plays. And that experience changed my life because it determined in my head that I was going to somehow be involved in theatre in future. And growing up as I did right at the end of the 60s as a teenager, you know, there was the World Theatre Season at Aldwych, there was Peter Brook's seminal A Midsummer Night's Dream, Vanessa Redgrave in Lady from the Sea at the Roundhouse, when the Roundhouse was more of a public toilet than it was a theatre. It was completely run down, but for companies to go there, it was affordable, and people were prepared to sit on the floor or some rickety chairs to see what was going on. And I remember seeing Vanessa Redgrave in the round, thinking, I never knew that you could act with your back. We were also involved with Lindsay Kemp and the Lady of the Flowers and experimental work in London and fringe theatre and theatre above pubs. So I felt that I had a pluralistic background and something to offer Hoxton. But, you know, in the end, Hoxton had more to offer me. The interesting thing about the education project in those days was that it wasn't just about making plays and putting them on. We divided our time, working week into two halves. One half of the week rehearsing and preparing plays and sometimes performing them in the daytime, mostly in the hall but sometimes outside, in schools and in other venues. And the other part of the week, we all had individual responsibilities for different aspects of the community. We ran an old age pensioners luncheon club, and each member of the team, there were 6 of us in all, plus a youth worker, and we had a certain number of older people assigned to us who came to the luncheon club. And mostly these people were either people who had no relations, or they had relations who'd moved out to Havering or Essex or further away, Southend, you know, that direction. And they all had wonderful stories to tell. They were individual personalities, and we really got to know them well. And I was very, very fond of 2 or 3 old ladies, one who was called Mary Ford. And Mary Ford lived in the flats opposite what was the Jeffrey Museum, now the Museum of the Home. One day she didn't come to the luncheon club, and the next day she didn't come, so the third day I went round to her flats and knocked on the door, and I said, Mary, why aren't you coming to lunch? And she said, I can't come no more, David. I keep getting blown over. So knocked down by the wind. So we used to walk around to the luncheon club, walk her back again, and one day I was in her flat looking out, and I said, oh, you know, it was 1977 and the Queen was doing a perambulation for her Jubilee. I said, you'll be able to see the Queen go by. And she said, no, I won't, David. The leaves will be on the trees. I won't see nothing. So I wrote to Geoffrey Daniels, who was the director of the Jeffrey Museum, and said, could Mary and me have a special place in the garden so that when the Queen stopped and walked round the front of the museum, she would be able to see the Queen. So we got an invitation, and on the day I went down onto Kingsland Road, and there were so many people, 6, 7 deep, that there was no way we could find our way through the crowd. So I said to a policeman, look, we've got these invitations and this very nice old lady's going to go and meet the Queen in the garden. So he said, leave it with me. So 4 policemen came and picked up the frail Mary, carried her horizontally across the crowd into the garden and put her on a seat. And I said to her, are you all right, Mary? And she said, I'm all right, David. I was frightened all those people could see up my skirt. And there is another story, which I'm not going to tell you, which was very vulgar, about a lady who kept getting caught short and how she coped with it. But that really is another story. But, you know, we ran an adult literacy group. 2 of my colleagues worked in Morning Lane, working with people with learning disabilities. We ran pottery classes, soft toy classes. We enabled people to do other things for and with us. We didn't do all this ourselves. There was a creche upstairs. I will tell you another story about the luncheon club. This wasn't one of mine, but there are a couple of people here who will remember Sarah at Hoxton Hall. Sarah was a lady whose parents were the last people to keep cows in Hoxton for milk. And she loved cats. And so she smelt rather of cats. And she used to come quite late to the luncheon club because all the others didn't like to sit next to her. And she kept coming later and later. And Elsie, who ran the luncheon club, said to her, look, Sarah, you've got to come before 2 o'clock because I've got to go. And that's the rule. 2 o'clock is the limit. So, you know, for a few days, Sarah came to the luncheon club and then began to come later and later. And then Elsie said to her, look, Sarah, I've told you, I've got your dinner here, but you can't have it because you're much too late. So Sarah took the plate and put it on Elsie's head. And there were peas and potatoes and gravy streaming down her face. And I think Terry said to Sarah, you know what we do with young people in the drama group? We ban them if they get up to no good, and so we're banning you for a fortnight. And she left the hall shouting, swines and devils, swines and devils. And I'm glad I got onto the drama groups, because we ran an adult drama group, a children's drama group, and a teenage drama group. And lots of people used to come and stand at the door or stand at the side, and after a little they would become involved. And this happened multiple times with people of different ages. And the level of illiteracy was really alarming. And we had a little cubbyhole room where I had 2 or 3 people that I looked after. My colleague John had more, and other of us had other people. But those people didn't like it to be known that they couldn't read. So they wanted somewhere discreet to go, and that wasn't into Hoxton Hall because it's where all that radical stuff went on. They wanted to go into the place next door where they could do it privately and quietly. And Shoreditch School, a lot of young people came to us from Shoreditch who otherwise wouldn't have found their ways in life. You know, they wanted something else, something different. And they brought some of the reluctant people with them who later became involved. You can see that it was a place where learning of all sorts went on. Everybody was in the mix and the change, and there was a great equality at the hall. Everybody had a role to play, from the people that we knew locally to the people that we were helping directly, and the people who began to set their sights outside Hoxton because of the confidence and the energy that we were able to impose. Now, you know, this hall is a really, really extraordinary place. It was opened on Monday, the 9th of November, 1863, and it was opened by a man who built it, who was interested in good social housing for working people in 1863. And his intention wasn't that it should be, as we imagine music hall is these days, but it should be a place of lantern slide lectures, showing the royal family traveling on the continent, or it should be language learning, or it should be a talk about good health and things like that. It did have a brief period where it was a much more popular venue with music hall stars, but that didn't really last because the LCC had new fire regulations which Hoxton Hall couldn't comply with, and so the music hall side was closed and the hall was bought by the Blue Ribbon Temperance Army. And they had a shop in Hoxton Street, and you could have coffee there, and if there was a service going on in the hall, you could take the bridge from the shop into the hall and sign the pledge on the way, and also get a free cup of coffee. And the Blue Ribbon Army, I didn't realize until recently, when a new book was published about Hoxton, that the Blue Ribbon Army was umbilically connected to the Peter Bedford Institute, the Bedford Institute Association that was the Quaker charity. And in 1894, the Quakers took over the running of Hoxton, and they are still our freeholders today. Now, just putting my hat on as chairman of governors at Hoxton Hall now, the social and moral commitment of the Quakers is a great advantage to us. It keeps us on the straight and narrow in terms of what we offer today at the hall, both the Activate project that Susie is responsible for, but also the type of programming that we have, or the social activities that we run. We no longer run an old age pensioners luncheon club, but we do run something called Strictly Hoxton for the over 55s that happens on monthly on a Wednesday morning, and is very popular, very busy, and full of people that don't have strong relationships outside where they live, or have a disability which means that they can't travel very far. And so the history of Hoxton Hall goes back certainly to 1863, but 1894, because we're still living the principles and the values that we Quakers hold good. And you know, we of course, we're a charity, so we have to write an annual report every year, and we're absolutely certain to make sure that we recognize our Quaker roots in that annual report by making sure that they see it, but also referring to them, because the values of equality that the Quakers hold so dear are similar to the ones that most people here, if not all people here, would also hold. And so it's a kind of wonderful tradition to feel that you're still living and helping people in a way that Hoxton Hall has been doing since 1863, and certainly since 1894. The first play that we worked on was in kind of the tradition of plays that Nevern Square had developed through their interest both in the history of Hoxton itself in the 18th and 19th century and in the context of melodrama. Now, I don't know, have you put up your hand if you have? Have you heard of Maria Martin and the Red Barn? Yes, a lot of people have. And I'll just give you a rundown. Maria Martin was a woman who was murdered by a man, supposedly, by a man called William Corder in 1827 in Polstead in Suffolk. Nasty, vindictive, privileged man who murdered this poor, innocent village girl for some act of spite. And what was so extraordinary was that the broadsheets, and I don't mean the Daily Mail or the Sun, but you know, the broadsheets of the time, got hold of the story and turned him into this villain. And he was found guilty. He was hung. He was anatomized. The notes of his trial were bound in his skin, and his skeleton was hung up in the Bury St Edmunds Museum. And they still have these artifacts, but they're not generally on show, I think. And as a result, a melodrama was devised called Maria Martin of the Red Barn. And Susie, if you play the first clip, this is Todd Slaughter, born in 1870 and died in the early 50s. And he was a melodrama specialist. This clip is about 4 minutes long.
Harder work than I thought. God, what a night! There, I think the grave is deep enough. Now to remove the ladder. Will she come, I wonder? God, what a night it is. A fitting night for such a purpose as mine. No one in sight. Will she fail me at the last moment? Oh no, she'll come. A woman will believe anything from the man she loves. Now to get the pistols ready. There's work for you tonight, my friends. There's someone coming across the field now. 'Tis she. 'Tis Maria at last.
You see, William, I have kept my word. You promised to make me your bride.
Yes, the bride of death. Look!
No!
Yes, into the grave you go, my lady. Alive you are hateful to me. Dead you will cease to be a menace.
You shan't kill me, you shan't! Oh, have pity!
No!
Out of my way!
Oh, no. Come here.
Oh, no! You brute! Take that!
You she-devil. You've nearly blinded me with that soil. Put that spade down. Fool to pit your puny strength against mine. Put it down. You hear?
Never! Never!
Then, damn you, take that. Is she dead? Oh, yes. And now to bury the body.
So you can see these melodramas were a bit like Hammer horror films, really. And so what we decided to do was to look at the story of William Corder and unpick it and see if the murder really could have been pinned on him. And it was a very interesting process, because what became clear was that Corder was part of a smuggling gang that was taking smuggled goods that arrived on the coast of Suffolk through Manningtree into London, and indeed was stitched up by a man called Beauty Smith, who Terry Goodfellow played. And it was done really in the style of Brecht, really, looking at the facts and putting the case together and proving that what was said through, if you like, social media wasn't in fact the truth. And this was, we first performed this in 1974-5, and it kept coming back into the repertoire because it was quite popular. And in 1977, we took it to Polstead in Suffolk because it was the 150th anniversary of the murder of Maria Martin. So we performed scenes from the play on the site of the Red Barn, which no longer exists. And we also played a full performance in the village hall at Polstead. And we were looking for Maria Martin's grave in the churchyard, and it doesn't exist because it's not marked, although she is buried there. And somebody came up to us and said, "What are you doing?" And we said, "You know, we're here doing this play about Maria Martin and the Red Barn." And he said, 150 years later, "There are people round here who are not particularly proud of Maria Martin." We created a forum play called A to Z about young people moving to London, or young people looking for accommodation in London, and the things that they would do socially or get up to. But the play had no end. We stopped it at a point at which two young people were deciding whether or not to continue their relationship, or whether they should break up and go their separate ways. And we'd say to the teenage audience, "So what do you think they should do?" So we'd have a discussion about the young people's options. And I think only one occasion did it happen, but mostly the audiences would say, these hard young people from Hoxton, "Oh, we think they're in love and that they should get married." So we'd have to improvise the last scene as the audience had decided, even though it went quite against the grain. A play based on The Alchemist by Ben Jonson was particularly pertinent to people living in social housing, having problems. This was a contemporary version of The Alchemist, in which a man who was living in a basement of a Victorian house had rats. So he goes to the town hall to find the rat department, falls into social services, where a high-handed young man thinks the man with the rat problem has mental problems. So he goes to see a psychiatrist who wants to diagnose him with schizophrenia. And so he gets into a system out of which he cannot get. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? My colleague, John Rake, came to a rehearsal one day saying he couldn't any longer develop the role of the social worker. And so all these devised processes comprised a lot of compromise and discussion. So we talked to John because, you know, John was very good at it and he was going to create a great character. But he said he couldn't do it. And then he came the following day and he said, "I've had an idea. I think I can do this, but I think I'll play it as a woman." So I remember taking him on the back of my motorbike to Petticoat Lane to be fitted for a cheesecloth dress, which caused a lot of hilarity in the market. And he had his black hair cut into a page boy cut, and he developed this character called Faith Care. I'm a social worker. I reach out and grab people's problems. And we had a colleague called Jan Evans, and Jan went on holiday that summer to Canada, and while she was there, she met a social worker called Faith Care. Later on, we produced a play called Negatives, 1915, based on the life of Edith Cavell, the nurse who was murdered by the Germans in 1915. And it was set in the First World War. Edith Cavell had trained at St Leonard's Hospital on Kingsland Road, but also at the Royal London Hospital. And we had constant problems with this play, not because it was a difficult subject, but because we had to find a way of collectively expressing the carnage of the First World War. John Rake played Earl Haig, and Earl Haig, I don't know if you know, was a kind of butcher really, just sending more and more men to the front, believing that simple artillery and horse power would overcome the Germans, who incidentally had bought the copyright on the Maxim machine gun, which the War Office in the UK had turned down. So they were able to mow men down through the First World War, and as you know, it was a terrible, terrible result. But expressing that on the stage, I think, is hard for anybody. Now, during this work, I went to see a performance of Tadeusz Kantor's The Dead Class at Riverside Studios. And I told my colleagues, I think we might have found the solution. And they went to see The Dead Class, and it solved all our problems. And Susie's going to show us a video clip. And so, on the one hand, we at Hoxton were very concerned about the well-being of the community, their ability to express themselves individually and collectively, but also to make sure that what we were doing was in some way cutting a new channel in community arts. Now, just to spend a couple of moments considering this, you know, in the 70s, the Arts Council was called the Arts Council of Great Britain, and they would only fund professional arts. And everything that we were doing, and the theatre and education movement across the whole country were doing, was seen as something between professional and amateur. So there was no money for the work that we would do, and that's why what we achieved at Hoxton Hall, or at least the colleagues who were responsible, Barclay Price and Terry, were responsible for, was raising money from places that weren't commonly supporters of direct arts funding. And in the first place, that was the Monument and Linbury Trust, funded by the Sainsbury family, and the Gulbenkian Foundation, which came together to create this team of 7 people to achieve this rather innovative work. And as we worked together, we realized that we were also part of this wider theatre and education movement across the whole of the UK, which had taken hold, and I'm afraid to say has more or less died now. You know, there was a wonderful writer called David Holman who just understood how to write plays for young people. Not plays that would pacify, or, yes, that's a good word, pacify young people and keep them attached to a screen, usually a television screen in those days, but plays that were all about world issues that would make young people activists. And I think that's to some extent what we wanted to do at Hoxton, although our activism wasn't politically driven. It was a sense of social responsibility, which again goes back to Quaker values. There were 2 lovely plays that we produced. John Rake, who's not here today, was marvellous as the boss of Zog. We produced these children's plays that became very popular. The second one was called The Garden Plot, and the boss of Zog was a kind of Hitlerite figure that wanted to create winter year-round and turn all gardens into car parks. And I played his auntie, who was just as evil, but she liked good manners and clean fingernails. So what about Hoxton in the future? I'm very proud to be chair of Hoxton Hall now, and I feel that if I can give back to Hoxton as much as it gave me, a full circle will be drawn. And we have a very active and lively program of live arts now of all kinds of genres. We have a wonderful CEO who is making our balance sheet look good. I mean, that's amazing to say in these times. We're very lucky that next door, in what was the Queen Mary Hostel, opened in 1929 by Queen Mary for the Girls' Guild for Good Life, is now owned by the GLA, and income from small units goes to fund our bottom line at Hoxton. We're about to commission a feasibility study to renovate and make the building more fit for purpose, and with a fair wind, build a new section on the hall, which will be committed to our work in creative health. In the belief that creativity makes everybody better. And that can be going to see a great band, or hearing jazz, or seeing a play, or seeing a bit of circus, or coming to Strictly Hoxton on a Wednesday morning. Or it can be taking part in a group activity, or learning the guitar, or a youth theatre play. And I've got one copy, I've left it in my bag a bit by mistake, of the new book about Hoxton Hall. And actually, Susie, this morning on Amazon, you can buy copies of the book for £29. And you can buy the hardback for £44.
There you go.
That was pointed out to me by somebody yesterday who I know.
I've got a copy if you want to have a look at it.
But you'd be very welcome to come and see the work that we're doing at Hoxton, both the public things that you can book up to see, always available on our website, but things that we run under the wire. We have a lot of young people who very much benefit from the safety and security of what Hoxton gives them, and then can move on to other more ambitious things in the wider part of London. You know, the Roundhouse runs this wonderful education program, but for some young people that's a big step out of the borough, out of your local area, into somewhere else. But Hoxton can be not only a place where you can develop and grow, but it can also be a stepping stone. And as I've said several times about Quaker principles, I'm really, really delighted that we are still living in that context. When I decided to leave Hoxton Hall to do other things, it was like leaving a religious order. You know, everybody was so serious about what we did, and it took up all our lives, and we really felt we were doing the right thing. And at the end of my time there, we began to talk about whether devised plays could be complemented by scripted ones. So I directed something called the Golden Pathway Annual, and then I was asked to do something at the City Lit. So lots of the Hoxton people that we had been working with came to perform in a production of Henry VIII that then came back to Hoxton. And I've got the poster that we produced for that here that will go into the archive. There are a few minutes left, and if you'd like to ask me any questions, no matter how strange, please do.
It just sounds like an amazing parallel with Oval House, which I was part of following rehearsing at Hoxton Hall, and it's just such an inspiring project that you talk about. Peter Oliver sounds as though he was a kind of relation of May in a way.
Yes, but you're kind of picking up on that, Norma, and you're right, because there was a groundswell, wasn't there? Things were able to happen. There wasn't exactly money, but people did it for practically nothing because their rents weren't so high, for one thing. And people felt that they were driven because they wanted to see social change. And that's what was extraordinary about the TIE movement. I made a note, and I was going to read it to you, and I will before we end, about David Holman, who was probably the most significant writer of plays for young people. In 1974, he wrote a heartbreaking play called Drink the Mercury, the first of his Rare Earth trilogy, inspired by mercury pollution in the Sea of Minamata in Japan. He anticipated climate change concerns by decades. Whale at the National Theatre and Solomon and the Big Cat at the Young Vic both concerned environmental and social justice. an exchange between Theatre Centre and the Young People's Wing of the Theatre Company of South Australia took him to Australia, where he then worked throughout the 1980s and where his plays appeared in the Australian national curriculum. And that gives you a hint, you know, he was wonderful, but he wasn't the only person. You know, there were many people writing plays that directly asked young people, what do you think of this? And if you have an opinion, what kind of action will you take? And I think in the world in which we live now, where there are virtually no really good youth clubs, where young people are really at sea, both morally and politically, these questions are so important to be asked again. Thank you so much for coming this afternoon.